Hi everybody, welcome back to Civil War Monitors Behind the Lines. I'm your host, David Thompson. Today, it's a privilege, as always, to be joined by Brian Craig Miller, who comes on the program once again. Brian is an associate professor of history at Emporia State University, and the recent author, yet another book coming out here, Empty Sleeves, Amputation in the Civil War South, which is now out with the University of Georgia Press. So, Brian, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Dave. It's great to be back behind the lines here.
Well, behind the lines, I guess, is a little appropriate here because we are talking about amputation, Civil War South. We think, and you properly point out, and I think I probably should start out, this book is wonderfully written, and I really recommend it to everybody. But you point out quite effectively, we have, to some degree, a very much a glorified view of this war, and recent attempts have been made to take what some scholars are calling the dark turns of the war and really try to expose some of the grim, harsh realities of it. And obviously amputation is one of these items that really should be in the forefront. So with that being said, why don't you offer us just a bit of a broad overview of the book itself?
Well, this came about particularly, this goes back to, I think, even my early childhood days of learning about the Civil War and being fascinated particularly by medicine. Actually, before I started as a history major in college, I was actually a pre-med biology major. I was very into anatomy and biological science, loved animals, loved learning how the human body functioned. And I remember that, when I was a kid, we went to Gettysburg all the time, and they had summer evening programs that the Rangers would do around 8 o'clock at night. And they did one on hospital medicine and amputation. And they actually had a medical kit that they actually had out for people to look at. And I was just fascinated by the saws and the scalpels, and they had one of the old tourniquets. All the items that ended up on the book cover were really the things as a kid that I was just found fascinating. And because it was grim and it piqued your curiosity that, this isn't maybe the traditional thing that you would enjoy learning about the American Civil War. I guess that's why I'm one of the weirdos here in the profession. But for me, I think as I began thinking about this more and more and connecting it to John Bell Hood, the exploration that I did for the previous book, wanting to know more about what his life was like as a double amputee, I started seeing more and more signs in my life, which I allude to a little bit of the epilogue about this. I started getting images in the mail of veterans from Afghanistan and Iraq who lost limbs, and they were asking for money to help raise funds to get them a prosthetic limb or get them a craft kit so they could just enjoy the holidays with their good limb, if you will. I saw an amputee running on one of those cheetah blades when I was in Washington, D.C., and I kept wondering, is there a lot about amputees throughout American history? And I came to find that that wasn't necessarily the case, that particularly with the American Civil War, we only have a few isolated studies and articles and a few medical histories here and there, but a lot of the source material there gravitates towards the North, and with good reason. There's a lot more source material readily available on the North, rather than, I think, for the Confederacy, which, because they burned so many medical records and it wasn't uniform in their data collection, it became a much tougher slog. So the goal of this book was to initially just look at the lives of amputees, but then I think it naturally sort of evolved in a way of looking at amputation from multiple angles, from the perspective of the surgeons and their role in making decisions about amputation, the patients themselves and what they actually had to say, whether they wanted to go through amputation or actually reject it and try to live their life with that damaged limb intact and take the risks that came with it. And then the process of them sort of transitioning back into civilian life and the role that the women would play, the society itself, and then ultimately the state governments, who ended up having to pick up the pieces because Confederate veterans, as you know and many of your viewers know, were not eligible to receive federal pension benefits or prosthetic limbs, mostly because of the language that had been inserted into the 14th Amendment, but also because they had been viewed as traitors. And so it was up to the state governments themselves to raise those funds.
Now, I wonder if we could circle back briefly to the idea of the sources that you're dealing with here. And I think a lot of individuals who study the South during the war, if you're looking for kind of a common experience, I think there's a lot of elite letters that perhaps were saved from prominent Virginia families, prominent North Carolina families, for instance. But when you're trying to deal with a topic this large and get as kind of as many perspectives as possible within the Confederacy, I'm sure it's very challenging. So I wondered if you could perhaps discuss a little bit of your approach to this topic.
Back in the summer of 2008, I was able to get, the university here has some internal research grants for a few $1,000s that you can get for the summer to go research. And I got one to say, okay, I'm going to go let's go to 4 southern states. So I decided to go to Texas, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Arkansas. And it was going to be a fact-finding mission to see if I could actually find enough material within 4 to 5 weeks to make this project work. It was sort of a test case. And if anyone is able to get grants like this, I certainly recommend doing it, to just going to a series of archives and seeing what exactly is there. And I started out at the University of Texas at Austin in their American History collection. They actually have the Samuel Stout papers, who was a prominent Confederate surgeon and left quite a bit of good medical records that are still intact. But a lot of it was walking into the archive saying, "Hi, I'm Brian, and I'm working on Confederate amputees." And you sort of get the, I think, here, and I would say, I would do the key search for amputation and leg and arm, and, as you go through the different card catalogs at various archives. But what I found throughout all of my trips was that the archivists I encountered were so gracious and kind with their time and energy and resources, and were so fascinated by the topic, maybe because they probably don't get asked that on a regular basis, of what sources do you have on Confederate amputees, the women who loved or tried to love them, and the state governments who had to deal with them. And so when you ask those questions, it's a lot of flipping through boxes and pages and a lot of dead ends. I think what I would encourage scholars to do is, particularly if you're doing a topic this broad where it's going to be a tougher challenge to find sources, just don't give up, just keep looking. And I usually frame this to the archivists, and they, particularly places I was there for several days, they knew that they would hand me a folder or a box, and it may take me 5 seconds to go through it, and I'm ready for the next source, particularly because it was just a dead end. The understanding that I got from the archivist was great in allowing me to just go through a massive amount of source material. It also helped that there are some collections and places out there that I thought were particularly strong and maybe are underutilized, especially the University of Alabama at Birmingham. Their medical school has the Reynolds Library. Anybody who's working on medical history of the Civil War or any topics connected, it should certainly go to that particular library. It was a donated collection of original surgical manuals, letters, anything that you want to know about the nuts and bolts of the medical procedure are available there in Birmingham. I also found archives particularly useful in places that I think many historians have gone, places like Virginia Historical Society and the Museum of the Confederacy in Richmond. But this project allowed me to visit every state in the South, utilizing archives from Kentucky, Tennessee, all of the Deep South, because I really wanted to give as much as possible a picture of the entire Confederacy and their experience with amputees. So at times, some of the source material is going to lean one direction or the other based on the material, but I thought I did what I could in trying to get perspectives from every single state here that sent Confederate amputees or brought them home from the war itself.
And you start us with the actual doctors, with the surgeons, and I wondered if you could kind of briefly discuss, how are they approaching this, in mindset, their mentality, as I'm sure for many of these doctors, certainly the ones that are, more junior, this is, the worst mass medical trauma events that they've ever experienced and probably will ever experience during the course of their profession.
Yeah, surgeons get to be the punching bag a little bit, I think, particularly in any popular culture depiction of the Civil War. For me, it was Gone with the Wind and Dr. Meade, performing that amputation that even Scarlett O'Hara couldn't deal with. It sends her running out of the hospital. But it's just that sort of image that we have painted in popular culture of Civil War surgeons as sort of Sweeney Todd, that they're going to come in, hack off the limb, wipe off the saw blade or the knife, and yell next and bring in the next patient. And, because we always get that sense that they are completely overwhelmed. And I think some of that has bled into some of the larger narratives of the American Civil War. A lot of times when you read the big narrative treatments of the Civil War, they usually have a paragraph or a few pages about the medical crisis, and the surgeons get a lot of blame. They say that they were overwhelmed, they didn't know how to deal with these types of injuries, they had little knowledge, little experience, and they just created butcher sheds, if you will, throughout the whole war. I think that's a fair assessment early on, particularly 1861 and 62, but for good reason. These are guys, those who came into the war as medical professionals who probably had never amputated anything in their life. I mean, these are frontier doctors or who are treating childhood illnesses. Maybe they had to deal with some gunshot wound if some guy fired a musket into his foot, or an industrial accident from time to time that may have taken place, particularly with railroad construction and some of the new iron foundries that are starting to pop up. But really, most of these guys had never done an amputation before. They had read about it in medical journals, certainly, that were available, but they didn't have the experience to tackle it. And so particularly when you look at some of the battle statistics that are available in 61 and 62, a lot of amputations took place when these surgeons were very green. But what I noticed, particularly from where I could find data, and the data on Confederate numbers is impossible. We'll never have an exact count on the number of Confederate amputees because the records are fragmented. A lot of them were destroyed. But what I was able to find was I would particularly notice that the number of amputations went down significantly as the war progressed, particularly when you're looking at some of the data in 1864 throughout the Atlanta campaign between Sherman and Hood and Johnson and in that particular region in Georgia, there were thousands of gunshot wounds treated in Confederate hospitals. Not that many of them resulted in amputation, and I think this is because the surgeons gained more knowledge and experience as they went through the war. They gained more medical personnel, which was key, so you didn't have just 3 guys doing all of the amputations, but they also, I think, always lived up to these high level of expectations that they themselves held. One of the things I think some historians have missed is that these are professional men who care about their reputation. They care about their career and job as medical individuals, and so they are wanting to do the best that they possibly can with as best of a bedside manner that they possibly can. So some of these instances I was able to uncover found that Confederate soldiers had initial impressions that this was going to be a horrific experience when they entered the hospital, but they found that their surgeon was caring for them, that the surgeon actually talked to them, that chloroform was usually available. It wasn't, oh, here, just bite on the stick, I'm gonna saw your leg off. It was, that a decision was properly made for the most part as the war progressed. So maybe that readers will take away from this particular chapter is that these surgeons, I think, deserve a little bit more tempered view of themselves, that they actually had a positive legacy on the war rather than a negative one, considering what they faced. A small number of surgeons, thousands of wounded when you look at battles like Bull Run and Shiloh early in the war, where they were just completely overwhelmed, and the adjustments that were subsequently made. I did not realize until getting into this project that the Confederate States had an extensive medical journal that they published throughout the course of the war. Most of the bigger issues were later on in the war, and they are enormously detailed. I mean, if you sit down and look through these things, and they were going step by step on how to deal with every sort of medical crisis that these surgeons were seeing in the fields. And that, I think, was enormously useful, and to me equates then ultimately a decline in the number of amputations as the war progressed. It's still horrific. I mean, it's still an entirely horrific experience, but at the same time, I think these surgeons deserve a little credit for trying their best and gaining an immense amount of knowledge that I think will prove enormously useful in the future.
And then we move into those that are actually, experiencing the amputation personally, I guess we should say. But there's a fact that you point out, and I think it's interesting, right, that not everybody experiences it, that they show up at the field hospital, they see what's going on, and I guess you could say they decide it's not for them.
Right.
So I wondered if you could try and help our viewers here and our listeners get into kind of the mindset of a Civil War soldier, who's entering one of these field hospitals during a battle, and kind of what's their mindset and how they're approaching losing a limb.
You can imagine that this is sort of sensory overload for them. The moment that they get shot, and Steve Barry has this great article about somebody going through that process and what that actually means, but at that moment, you're sort of laying there waiting, because there is a sort of this waiting line, if you will, of patients to get into the field hospital itself to see the surgeon. And that's where I think the sensory overload is going to play tricks with your mind. The whole game of waiting, where you're going to hear people screaming, you're going to hear shouts and moans, you're going to sort of see a very horrific sight, you're going to see some limbs being cut off if you're waiting very, very close by to where the table is actually set up. You're going to see blood everywhere. You're going to obviously smell a lot of some of the scents that are coming in from the hospital itself. And I think for some of these men, it's going to put them in a point where they have to actually sort of take stock in their own life and realize, what do they want from their life going forward. Particularly what I discovered for officers, more often than regular soldiers, they seem to have this moment once they are brought into the tent itself, or where the operation is going to take place, that they're going to be given a choice. A lot of that is by their own decisions that they made. For example, I came across Confederate officers and soldiers who took upon violence to make sure that they did not have a limb amputated, threatening to kill their surgeon, kicking him, grabbing a gun that had been hidden and trying to shoot the surgeon himself just so you could save a finger or save an arm or a leg, because it meant different things to different men. Some men believed that their body needed to be whole because they needed to return home in that particular capacity, especially if they were the breadwinner in their family and had a wife and children to take care of back home. I found a case of a doctor who didn't want amputated, who had gotten injured in the war and didn't want an amputation to take place because he did not believe that his patients back home, as a physician, that they wouldn't want to come to see a doctor who he himself looked like he needed medical attention. Others quite worried about their own relationships and the fact that they would return home and their fiancés, their spouses would want nothing to do with a handicapped individual, and that they would shun the relationship and leave them on their own accord. Others had to get back out to the battlefield. And if you're in the midst of battle and you have a finger or an arm or a leg that needs taken off, the longer you have to recover, the longer it's going to take for you to be out on the field leading your men or participating in a charge where you believe it is important for you to earn your valor, your honor, your manhood on the field of battle. And I think that is why I was able to come across some of these examples of men who just simply rejected amputation, or realized that they would rather just take the medical risks and flee and be labeled a coward, but at least they would still have their body physically intact. And others, of course, had to acquiesce to their surgeons and say, go ahead, cut off the limb, do what you think is best, and then hope that they will be able to heal and move about their life and return to normal as quickly as possible.
And now we turn to, and I liked how you phrased this earlier, the women that loved these men or tried to. So I wondered, what is the experience like for Southern women who are either firsthand witnessing these amputations, or are seeing men come back and be it a loved one, be it a sibling, this is the new reality. How do they handle these situations?
You think about that, once these men are sort of, the amputation ends and they're sort of waking up and coming back to their normal senses, female face is probably one of the first faces that they will actually see in the form of nurses who are coming through to care for these men as they recover and prepare to move to another hospital or another location, or even actually go back into the war or return home. So for me, it made natural sense to examine, well, how did women actually react to seeing these amputees in three different ways? As nurses, as benevolent workers who were trying to raise funds for buying prosthetic limbs, or gathering some medical supplies and donating them to care for these men while they were recovering in the hospital from the amputation. And then the women who actually had to deal with these men in relationships. I was curious if, because so much of Southern society is based on these notions of manhood and womanhood and how men are supposed to look and act like a strong masculine figure, does that change a woman's perception when that strong masculine figure comes back to the homestead in a changed state, missing an arm, missing a leg, having a massive gunshot wound somewhere that's readily visible to the spouse, that they can see this on a daily basis, and also now realize that relationship that they knew before the war has now completely changed, even been flipped upside down on its head, where she may have to actually be completely in charge of that household, sort of shifting notions of dependency, if you will. What I discovered is that Southern women actually flocked to the bedsides. There were large numbers of women who were interested in nursing services when they could stomach it. I mean, it was certainly a difficult work that many of these women dealt with. And they became sort of the eyes and ears of these soldiers, helping them deal with the trauma of missing a limb. Writing letters to loved ones and family members, a lot of times women assuring these men, look, show your empty sleeve, show your scar to your fiance, she will accept you, she will love you all the more. While that happened from time to time, it also did not. And I found a few cases of nurses who were pretty upset that they had assured this Confederate patient everything's going to be okay, we're going to write this letter to your fiance, and then the fiance sends word back to the hospital that she's no longer interested, don't bother, particularly she needs somebody who she can actually rely on to care for her, to be a breadwinner for her in her life. This also happens as these men start to return home. You see women flock to them, very interested in getting into relationships with amputees, and then others who want absolutely nothing to do with them. And then others who are simply ambivalent about it. It really becomes a broad spectrum of reactions. But I think for me, what was most important was to see that this broad spectrum and to realize that for the most part, women actually did embrace these disabled men as they return home and really became the main focal points to help, I think, rehabilitate these men in Southern society, rebuild their shattered masculine identity, and in some ways rebuild the Southern society itself, especially as we'll talk about here, that these veterans had a difficult time with state governments and particularly some of the memory organizations and really helping them survive. It ultimately goes to these women who have to tie the men to the plow in the morning and who have to feed them and help them walk to church on a daily basis. This becomes their new reality, and they are crucial in making that happen.
So as we shift and we move back towards the quote-unquote home front, I guess, which can be a dicey phrase, I suppose. I shouldn't necessarily use it, but as these men return home and they're facing this new reality, and how are they trying to deal with it? How do they wrestle? How do they struggle with it? And how do state governments play a role in this? And I think that's something that people, they just forget because they assume, or if they've looked at any sort of medical studies in the war, or anything dealing with veterans. I'm thinking, Jim Martin's work and Brian Jordan's work recently. Obviously, you have a lot of federal government involvement once you get federal pensions for Northern soldiers. As you rightly point out, nothing exists of that kind at the federal level for Confederate soldiers. So how does the state government ultimately step in as well?
These men who are coming home with empty sleeves are entering a world of Southern society that doesn't necessarily know what to make of these empty sleeves. Some of the accounts that I was able to uncover of amputees before the American Civil War were ridiculed. I mean, these are even guys who were heroes in the Mexican War and the Texas conflict for independence, that they were ridiculed, that they would have their prosthetic wooden leg kicked out from under them by kids on the streets, particularly, and because Southern society didn't know how to deal with these men. They ran counter to notions of how Southern men should look and act on a regular basis. Now these men return back to their communities with also this cloud of defeat hanging over them. There is no grand parade for these amputees to sort of go down Pennsylvania Avenue across communities in the South and be hailed as heroes. They sort of individually or in groups come back to their communities. Some are welcomed, some are shunned and left to sort of be on their own. Some are left, I found this account of a veteran who had lost a leg, who ends up getting drunk and passing out on a street corner in Macon, Georgia, and some kids come by and saw off his prosthetic leg. I mean, that became his reality, when in other instances you had some accounts of visitors in places like Savannah, Georgia, that said, if you show your empty sleeve, you will, of course, get help and assistance from women who are there to help you. Part of this, I think, is because, Jefferson Davis, as the war was crumbling, was calling on Southern women to help amputated men, to build them up as the new aristocracy. And I think some people took that literally and tried to do that as best as they could, but other communities did not. You have places where veterans have no financial resources, have to beg for work, are denied jobs, or removed from their position because of their physical state, and thus are left to beg on street corners. In some communities, places like New Orleans, they actually rounded up veterans who were begging on the corners, asking for money, particularly because people complained that they didn't want to have to constantly see maimed men asking for money on a daily basis. There's this great account of a Confederate amputee who sits on the state steps of the Capitol building in Austin, Texas, selling pencils to guilty legislators who for years had denied these men pensions, prosthetic limbs, because they didn't believe it was constitutional to support veterans. That there was nothing in the Texas Constitution that says, yes, we need to take care for these men. So instead, Texas will be one of these states that passes a land grant provision. Texas and Louisiana both gave injured veterans large plots of land, which not coincidentally were in parts of the state that were unsettled, trying to move people to other areas of these big states like Texas and Louisiana at the time that had isolated pockets of population. I think as initially we see 7 southern states pass prosthetic limb programs pretty quickly. Some of this has been detailed very effectively, particularly North Carolina's program by Ansley Wegner's book. I think Phantom Pain is the correct title, or Phantom Limb. It's a great account of what had happened in North Carolina, which was one of the first states out the gate. And the other southern states that actually passed and started prosthetic limb programs had extensive debates about them, not just whether they should do this, whether it was financially feasible, but also which limb company should get to manufacture and supply the state with all of the prosthetic limbs. And there were some concerns by legislators that we don't want Yankee limbs. Some of the big manufacturers were coming out of Philadelphia and New York at the time period, and some were actually worried that Yankee limbs were coming down to infest the South. So it became big business for these 7 states pretty quickly, but then it tapered off. There were cash payments that you could get instead of the prosthetic limb. Some of them broke. They caused a lot of discomfort for some of the individuals who wore them, or they didn't feel the need to get them. And then you sort of get into this holding period by the 1870s, 1880s, where veterans are again left on their own without any financial means until you start to see state governments pass pretty extensive pension programs that will take some time, actually. The last pension program will go into place in Kentucky in 1912 for Confederate veterans. And what's interesting about this process, I didn't necessarily think I was going to get into all the political nuts and bolts about pensions and prosthetic limbs, but I found so much cantankerous rhetoric, particularly from governors who were unionists during the war, who were not willing to sign any sort of pension legislation. Arkansas actually, in the 1860s, passed a massive comprehensive pension program that would have taken care of wounded veterans, orphans, widows, and it was vetoed by the unionist government. And then, of course, we start to see politics changing hands, and that program sort of was scrapped for 2 decades. And it seems odd that states had to battle within themselves about the constitutionality of whether or not they should care for their veterans. And for many veterans, by the time they got that all ironed out, it was simply too late, and they were gone. And they certainly did not have the financial resources in their communities from benevolent groups, and certainly many of the groups in the Lost Cause, Our Lady's organizations, the United Confederate Veterans and so forth, that talked quite a bit about wanting to care for wounded veterans, ended up spending money or getting involved in large fights about textbook passages or monument construction, rather than we need to raise $50,000 to take care of these 100 families who are destitute.
So Brian, what's the big takeaway here then, with Empty Sleeves and with amputation in the Civil War South, as well as, and I suppose to a larger extent, trauma during the war?
Yeah, I think what I would hope that the reader took away from this is that this book in some ways is helping us redefine how manhood and womanhood function within the South. You know, a lot of historians have done a beautiful job of talking about that the Civil War is certainly this crisis in gender, particularly in how men and women are defining themselves. But I think if we actually look at that through the lens of men who are physically wounded, who are coming home as the, if you will, the antithesis of what a Southern man is supposed to look like, that demands a recalculation in how you think about that particular man when you see him, especially since so much of antebellum culture took those who were disabled and ridiculed them, put them in the sideshow tents that you would see from people like Barnum and these shows that would travel across the South. I mean, that's where disabled individuals ended up. rather than, I think, at the center of this new society that was being recreated or rebuilt, if you will, North and South. I also hope in some ways it leads to larger explorations of injured veterans and those who were interconnected to them. I mean, as I mentioned in the introduction, there are all sorts of other injuries that these men are coming home from. Granted, amputees are not a huge number if you're looking at the millions of men who fought in the Civil War, but I think culturally they are an important number, and are culturally they're an important representation, if you will. And certainly, as we have to think about war going forward, you know, the United States is now dealing with large numbers of amputees who are coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan and are facing similar issues. We see reports all the time of homeless vets, of those who are having to turn to instances of poverty, alcohol or drug abuse, because they don't have the financial resources or the community support groups that they need in order to help transition back to civilian life. And in some ways, I thought that this book would at least begin that dialogue of how we need to think about the larger issues that veterans are facing across the entire country throughout our time, or our existence, if you will.
Well, Brian, thank you so much for taking some time to speak with us today. Again, everyone, the book's Empty Sleeves, Amputation in the Civil War South, out with the University of Georgia Press in their Uncivil War series. As I said before, it's very well written, and I hope it begins a further conversation, as you have alluded to here towards the end, of broader medical trauma during the war for Southerners, beyond amputation, those that lived with a wound, be it a physical, as you point out in the introduction, a bullet that's lodged in your shoulder for the rest of your life that you're in chronic pain from, as well as kind of the I don't want to say invisible, but those that aren't quite so visible when it comes to psychological or mental trauma. And there are a lot of great scholars out there who are looking at this, both north and south, but I hope that this book right here offers a wonderful template for them moving forward. So, Brian, thank you so much for coming on, and perhaps we can have you on yet again with the next project.
Thanks so much, Dave. I greatly appreciate it.